January 12, 1995. University of Tennessee campus becomes a torture chamber as 18-year-old Christa Pike lures fellow student Colleen Slemmer to a secluded wooded area, then spends 30 minutes torturing her to death with a box cutter and chunk of asphalt, making her the youngest woman sentenced to death in America. Christa had convinced 19-year-old Colleen to walk with her to an isolated spot on campus under the pretense of making peace after weeks of tension between them. But peace was never Christa's intention. She had brought along her boyfriend, Tatterell Shipp, and another friend, planning what would become one of the most brutal murders in Tennessee history. Once they reached the secluded area, Christa's mask of friendship dropped completely. She pulled out a box cutter and began slashing at Colleen's face and throat, while her victim screamed for help that would never come. But the cutting was just the beginning of Colleen's nightmare. Christa picked up a chunk of asphalt from the ground and began smashing it into Colleen's skull, crushing bone and brain tissue while the teenager begged for her life. The attack continued for 30 minutes of pure torture, with Christa showing no mercy or remorse as she systematically destroyed another human being. But even after Colleen was dead, Christa wasn't finished. She used the box cutter to carve a pentagram into her victim's chest, marking the body with satanic symbols that reflected her fascination with dark occult practices. The pentagram was carved deep enough to leave permanent scars on the corpse. Then Christa committed the most disturbing act of all. She used the box cutter to remove a piece of Colleen's skull, which she kept in her jacket pocket as a trophy of the murder. For days after the killing, Christa carried around the skull fragment like a souvenir, showing it to friends and bragging about what she had done. Christa Pike wasn't some hardened criminal with a long history of violence. She was an 18-year-old college student from a broken home who had become obsessed with Satanism, violence, and the idea of killing another person. Her troubled childhood had included abuse and neglect, but nothing that explained the level of sadistic cruelty she displayed during Colleen's murder. The killing was motivated by jealousy over Tatterell Shipp, Christa's boyfriend who had shown interest in Colleen. Instead of confronting the romantic rivalry through normal means, Christa decided that torture and murder were the appropriate responses to her jealousy. When police discovered Colleen's mutilated body in the woods, they were shocked by the level of violence and the satanic symbols carved into her chest. The investigation quickly led to Christa, who had been bragging about the murder and showing off the skull fragment to anyone who would listen. Christa's arrest made national headlines when prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty against the teenager. At 18 years old, she became the youngest woman ever sentenced to death in the United States, a record that still stands today. The case revealed the depths of evil that can exist in someone so young, challenging assumptions about teenage violence and female killers. Christa had planned and executed a torture murder with the same methodical approach that experienced serial killers use against their victims. During her trial, Christa showed no remorse for torturing Colleen to death or for keeping pieces of her skull as trophies. Her lack of emotion and continued fascination with the murder convinced the jury that she deserved the ultimate punishment. How does an 18-year-old college student become so consumed with evil that she tortures a classmate to death and keeps her skull as a trophy? How does jealousy over a boyfriend escalate to 30 minutes of systematic torture and satanic mutilation? But Christa Pike's torture chamber was just the beginning of Tennessee's darkest secrets. Welcome to Savage Case Files, where we expose the volunteer state's most heinous female criminals, women who turn Tennessee's college campuses, family homes, and classrooms into scenes of unimaginable violence. In today's true crime documentary, you'll witness 7 cases that prove Tennessee harbors some of America's most shocking women killers, from death row torturers to child starvation murderers to pastor-killing wives. Subscribe if you love true crime documentaries like this one, because we're bringing you more cases that expose how the most respected positions can mask the darkest crimes. The next case will show you how a young woman became an accomplice in one of the most horrific hate crimes in American history. Case 2, Vanessa Coleman. January 6, 2007. Knoxville, Tennessee. 21-year-old Vanessa Coleman was about to participate in one of the most brutal hate crimes in American history when she helped kidnap University of Tennessee students Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom, beginning a nightmare of torture, rape, and murder that would shock the nation. Vanessa wasn't some hardened criminal who had spent years building up to violent crime. She was a young woman who made the conscious choice to participate in the kidnapping and prolonged torture of two innocent college students who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom were a young couple enjoying a dinner date when they were carjacked at gunpoint in Knoxville. What began as a robbery quickly escalated into a multi-day torture session that would claim both of their lives in ways too horrific for most people to comprehend. Vanessa was present at the house where the victims were taken after the carjacking, and she actively participated in the crimes that followed. She wasn't a passive observer who was too frightened to intervene. She was an accomplice who helped facilitate the torture and sexual assault of both victims. The details of what happened to Shannon and Christopher over the next several days represent some of the most extreme violence ever documented in Tennessee criminal history. Both victims were subjected to prolonged sexual assault, torture, and degradation before being murdered in separate locations. Christopher Newsom was shot execution-style, and his body was set on fire near railroad tracks, while Shannon Christian was kept alive longer to endure additional torture before being suffocated and her body stuffed into garbage bags inside a trash can. Vanessa's role in these crimes wasn't limited to being present during the violence. She actively participated in the kidnapping and helped facilitate the conditions that allowed the torture to continue for days without the victims being able to escape or call for help. The investigation revealed that Vanessa had multiple opportunities to help the victims or contact police, but instead chose to remain at the house and continue participating in the crimes. Her actions demonstrated a complete disregard for human life and dignity. The case became one of the most controversial and heavily prosecuted crimes in Tennessee history, with multiple defendants facing various charges related to the kidnapping, rape, torture, and murder of the two college students. Vanessa's trial revealed the extent of her participation in the crimes and her lack of remorse for the suffering inflicted on Shannon and Christopher. The evidence showed that she had been an active participant rather than a reluctant witness to the violence. The brutality of the Christian Newsom murders shocked even experienced law enforcement officers who had investigated countless violent crimes throughout their careers. The level of torture and degradation inflicted on the victims was beyond what most people could imagine. Vanessa Coleman was convicted of facilitation of first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping and rape, receiving a sentence of 35 years in prison for her role in one of the most heinous crimes in Tennessee history. Her case demonstrated how quickly someone can go from being a regular young person to becoming an accomplice in crimes so brutal that they defy comprehension. The Christian Newsom murders remain one of the most shocking examples of human cruelty in modern American criminal history. From hate crime participation to campus violence, in Tennessee's next case of student-on-student murder, Case 3, Shanterica Madden. September 2011. Middle Tennessee State University dormitory. 20-year-old Shanterica Madden was about to turn a college dorm room into a murder scene when she pulled out a knife and stabbed fellow student Tina Stewart to death during what began as a verbal altercation between roommates. Shanterica wasn't some stranger who had broken into the dormitory to commit random violence. She was an MTSU student living in the same residence hall as her victim, someone who should have been part of the campus community that provided safety and support for young people pursuing their education. Tina Stewart was a 19-year-old student who had come to MTSU to build a better future for herself through higher education. She was living in the university dormitory system that was supposed to provide a secure environment where students could focus on their studies without fear of violence. The confrontation between Chanterica and Tina began as the type of dispute that happens regularly in college dormitories. Disagreements over living arrangements, personal conflicts, or social tensions that are normally resolved through conversation or mediation by residence hall staff. But instead of seeking help from university officials or simply walking away from the argument, Chanterica decided that violence was the appropriate response to whatever conflict had developed between her and Tina. She armed herself with a knife and prepared to escalate the dispute to deadly force. When the argument reached its peak, Chanterica attacked Tina with the knife, stabbing her multiple times in the dormitory room that should have been a safe space for both young women. The attack was swift and brutal, leaving Tina with fatal wounds that would end her life and her dreams of completing college. Tina Stewart died from her stab wounds, becoming another victim of campus violence that shattered the sense of security that students and parents expect from university housing. Her death sent shockwaves through the MTSU community and raised questions about safety in residence halls. The investigation into Tina's murder was straightforward, with evidence clearly pointing to Chanterica as the perpetrator of the stabbing. The crime had occurred in a controlled environment with limited access, making it relatively easy for police to identify and arrest the killer. Chanterica's motive for the murder remained unclear even after her arrest and prosecution. The dispute that led to the stabbing appeared to be the type of minor conflict that occurs regularly among college students, making her decision to use deadly force seem completely disproportionate to the situation. The case highlighted the dangers that can exist even in supposedly safe environments like university dormitories, where young people are learning to live independently while pursuing their education. Tina's murder proved that violence can erupt anywhere, even in places designed to protect students. Chanterica Madden was convicted of second-degree murder for the stabbing death of Tina Stewart, receiving a sentence of 29 years in prison for turning a college dormitory into a crime scene and ending the life of a fellow student who had simply been trying to get an education. Her case became a reminder that campus violence can come from within the student community itself, not just from external threats. The murder of Tina Stewart represented a betrayal of the trust and safety that should exist among students sharing living spaces. From campus murder to jealousy killing in Tennessee's next case of romantic rivalry turned deadly. Case 4, Jessica Kennedy. May 2011, Monroe County, Tennessee. Jessica Kennedy was consumed by jealousy over a romantic rival. But instead of confronting her feelings through normal means, she decided that luring Brittany McMillan to a remote location and murdering her was the perfect solution to eliminate the competition for a man's affections. Jessica wasn't some stranger who had randomly targeted Brittany for violence. She knew her victim personally and had developed an obsessive hatred based on romantic jealousy that would ultimately drive her to commit premeditated murder in one of Tennessee's most cold-blooded cases of relationship violence. Brittany McMillan was a young woman who had become the target of Jessica's jealousy through no fault of her own. She was simply living her life and pursuing relationships like any normal person, unaware that someone was plotting her death because of romantic competition. The murder plot required extensive planning and deception on Jessica's part. She had to figure out how to get Brittany alone in a location where she could kill her without being discovered, then execute the plan without leaving evidence that would lead back to her. Jessica used lies and manipulation to lure Brittany to the remote location where she planned to commit the murder. She convinced her victim to meet her under false pretenses, exploiting whatever relationship or trust existed between them to set up the killing. When Brittany arrived at the isolated location, she had no idea that she was walking into a death trap. Jessica had chosen the spot specifically because it was far from any witnesses or help, giving her the privacy she needed to commit murder without being interrupted. The attack on Brittany was swift and brutal, with Jessica showing no mercy or hesitation as she killed the woman she viewed as a romantic obstacle. The murder was motivated purely by jealousy and the desire to eliminate someone she saw as competition. Brittany McMillan died alone in that remote location, the victim of another woman's jealousy and inability to handle romantic rejection or competition in a healthy way. Her death was completely preventable and served no purpose other than satisfying Jessica's need for revenge. The investigation into Brittany's murder revealed the extent of Jessica's planning and the jealousy-based motive that had driven her to kill. Evidence showed that this wasn't a crime of passion, but a deliberate and premeditated murder designed to eliminate a romantic rival. Jessica's behavior after the murder demonstrated her lack of remorse for taking Brittany's life. She showed no emotion or regret for destroying another person, simply because of jealousy over a man who may not have even been worth fighting over. The case highlighted how romantic jealousy can escalate to deadly violence when people are unable to handle rejection or competition in mature ways. Jessica had chosen murder over simply accepting that she couldn't control other people's romantic choices. Jessica Kennedy was convicted of first-degree murder for the premeditated killing of Brittany McMillan, receiving a life sentence that ensured she would never again have the opportunity to harm someone out of jealousy or romantic obsession. Her case served as a warning about how dangerous jealousy can become when it's allowed to fester and grow into homicidal rage. Brittany's death was a tragic reminder that some people will kill rather than accept that they can't always get what they want in relationships. From jealousy murder to child starvation in Tennessee's most heartbreaking case of maternal cruelty. Case 5, Erica Dotson. March 2006, Shelby County, Tennessee. Erica Dotson was responsible for caring for a 7-year-old child, but instead of providing the love and protection that every child deserves, she systematically starved and tortured the helpless victim to death through months of deliberate abuse that would shock even experienced investigators. Erica wasn't some overwhelmed caregiver who accidentally harmed a child through neglect or a moment of lost control. She was a woman who had made the conscious decision to torture a 7-year-old through starvation, turning what should have been a safe home environment into a chamber of prolonged suffering. The 7-year-old victim was completely dependent on Erica for food, shelter, and basic care, making the child utterly helpless against the systematic abuse that would ultimately claim their life. This wasn't a case where the child could escape or seek help. They were trapped with their abuser. Erica's method of torture was particularly cruel because starvation is a slow and agonizing way to die. The child would have experienced weeks or months of increasing hunger, weakness, and physical deterioration, while begging for food that Erica deliberately withheld. The starvation wasn't the only form of abuse that Erica inflicted on the helpless child. Evidence showed that she had subjected the victim to additional forms of torture and cruelty that compounded the suffering caused by the deliberate withholding of food. As the child's condition deteriorated from malnutrition and abuse, Erica continued the torture instead of seeking medical help or simply providing the basic care that could have saved the victim's life. She watched a 7-year-old slowly dying and chose to let the suffering continue. The child's final days would have been filled with unbearable pain, confusion, and terror as their small body shut down from starvation and abuse. They died alone with their torturer, never understanding why the person responsible for their care had chosen to destroy them instead. When the child's body was discovered, the evidence of prolonged starvation and abuse was immediately apparent to investigators and medical examiners. The victim's condition told the story of systematic torture that had continued for an extended period before death. The investigation revealed that Erica had multiple opportunities to stop the abuse and save the child's life, but had instead chosen to continue the torture until it resulted in death. Her actions demonstrated a level of cruelty that defied comprehension. Erica's motive for torturing the child to death remained unclear even after extensive investigation. There was no rational explanation for why someone would choose to systematically starve and abuse a helpless 7-year-old who depended on them for survival. The case highlighted the vulnerability of children who are completely dependent on adults for their basic needs and safety. The victim had no way to protect themselves or escape from the person who was supposed to care for them. Erica Dotson was convicted of first-degree felony murder and aggravated child abuse for the starvation and torture death of the 7-year-old victim. She received a life sentence that ensured she would never again have the opportunity to harm a child. Her case became one of the most disturbing examples of child abuse in Tennessee history, demonstrating how some people will torture the most vulnerable victims simply because they have the power to do so. The 7-year-old's death was a tragedy that could have been prevented if Erica had chosen compassion over cruelty. From child torture to pastor murder in Tennessee's most controversial case of religious community violence. Case 6, Mary Winkler. March 22, 2006, McNairy County, Tennessee. Mary Winkler crept into her bedroom where her husband Matthew, a beloved Church of Christ pastor, lay sleeping, raised a 12-gauge shotgun, and pulled the trigger, shooting him in the back and creating one of the most shocking scandals in Tennessee's religious community. Mary wasn't some stranger who had broken into the parsonage to commit random violence. She was the pastor's wife, a woman who stood beside Matthew every Sunday as he preached to their congregation about love, forgiveness, and Christian values, while secretly planning his murder. Matthew Winkler was a respected minister who had dedicated his life to serving God and his community through the Church of Christ. He was known as a devoted father to their 3 young daughters and a spiritual leader who genuinely cared about the members of his congregation. The shooting occurred in the early morning hours while Matthew was defenseless and asleep in his own bed. Mary had chosen the moment when her husband was most vulnerable, ensuring that he would have no opportunity to defend himself or escape from her attack. After shooting Matthew in the back with the shotgun, Mary didn't call for help or attempt to save her husband's life. Instead, she gathered up their 3 daughters and fled Tennessee, driving to Alabama where she hoped to avoid prosecution for the murder she had just committed. Matthew survived the initial shooting but died from his injuries, leaving behind 3 young children who had lost their father and would soon discover that their mother was his killer. The girls became orphans in the most traumatic way possible. The manhunt for Mary and the children captured national attention as law enforcement agencies across multiple states searched for the pastor's wife, who had murdered her husband and kidnapped their daughters. The case shocked religious communities nationwide. When Mary was finally arrested in Alabama, she was found with the 3 girls in a beach resort, apparently trying to start a new life after murdering their father. Her calm demeanor during the arrest suggested no remorse for what she had done to her family. The investigation revealed that Mary had been struggling with financial problems and marital issues, but nothing that seemed to justify shooting her husband in the back while he slept. Her motive remained unclear, even after extensive questioning. Mary's defense team argued that she had been the victim of domestic abuse and that the shooting was justified as self-defense, despite the fact that Matthew had been asleep and posed no immediate threat when she killed him. The case divided the religious community, with some people supporting Mary's claims of abuse, while others were outraged that she had murdered a man of God in cold blood and then fled with their children. At trial, Mary was convicted of voluntary manslaughter rather than murder, a verdict that shocked many observers who believed she deserved a much harsher punishment for killing her pastor husband. The most controversial aspect of the case was Mary's sentence, only 210 days in jail plus probation for taking the life of her husband and leaving 3 children without a father. The light sentence sparked outrage and questions about whether the justice system had failed. Mary Winkler served her brief jail sentence and was released, having spent less than a year behind bars for shooting her husband to death. Her case became a symbol of how domestic violence claims can sometimes result in surprisingly lenient sentences. The contrast between Mary's 210-day sentence and the life sentences, or death penalties, received by other women killers in Tennessee highlighted the inconsistencies in how the justice system treats different types of murder cases. From pastor murder to teacher predator in Tennessee's final case of authority figure abuse. Case 7. Pamela Rogers Turner. 2004 to 2005. Warren County, Tennessee. Former elementary school teacher and beauty queen Pamela Rogers Turner was using her position of trust and authority to repeatedly sexually abuse a 13-year-old student, turning her classroom into a hunting ground for child predation that would destroy an innocent victim's childhood. Pamela wasn't some random predator who had targeted a child through chance encounters. She was a trusted educator who had been given responsibility for shaping young minds and protecting vulnerable students, but instead chose to exploit her position to commit horrific crimes against a child. The 13-year-old victim was a student who should have been safe in Pamela's classroom, protected by the professional boundaries and ethical standards that are supposed to govern teacher-student relationships. Instead, the child became the target of systematic sexual abuse by someone they trusted. Pamela's abuse of the student wasn't a single incident or momentary lapse in judgment. She engaged in repeated sexual contact with the 13-year-old over an extended period, demonstrating a pattern of predatory behavior that showed complete disregard for the child's well-being and development. The abuse represented a profound betrayal of the trust that parents, students, and the community had placed in Pamela as an educator. She had violated every professional and moral standard that governs the relationship between teachers and their students. As a former beauty queen, Pamela had been held up as a role model in her community, someone who represented the best qualities of leadership and character. Her crimes shattered that image and revealed the predator hiding behind the facade of respectability. The investigation into Pamela's abuse of the student revealed the extent of her inappropriate relationship with the child and the methods she had used to groom and manipulate her victim. The evidence showed deliberate, predatory behavior rather than any kind of consensual relationship. Pamela's initial prosecution resulted in a plea deal that gave her approximately 9 months in jail for the sexual abuse of her 13-year-old student. The light sentence sparked outrage from those who believed she deserved much harsher punishment for her crimes. But Pamela's story didn't end with her release from jail. She violated the terms of her probation by continuing to contact the victim, demonstrating that she had learned nothing from her prosecution and remained a danger to the child she had already abused. The probation violations showed that Pamela was unable or unwilling to respect the boundaries that had been established to protect her victim from further harm. Her continued contact with the child proved that she remained a predator who couldn't be trusted to follow court orders. When Pamela violated her probation, she was sentenced to 6 years in prison for the additional offenses related to her continued contact with the victim. The longer sentence reflected the court's recognition that she posed an ongoing threat to the child. Pamela eventually served her full sentence and was released from prison, but her case had already done irreparable damage to the victim and shattered trust in the educational system that had failed to protect a vulnerable child from a predatory teacher. The case highlighted how predators can hide behind positions of respect and authority while using those same positions to access and abuse vulnerable victims. Pamela had weaponized her role as a teacher to commit crimes against a child who should have been safe in her classroom. Her crimes also demonstrated how the justice system sometimes fails to adequately punish those who abuse positions of trust. particularly when the initial sentences are too lenient to reflect the severity of the crimes committed against child victims. 7 women, 20 years of violence, dozens of innocent lives destroyed across Tennessee's campuses, homes, and communities. From Christa Pike's torture chamber to Pamela Rogers Turner's classroom predation, we've witnessed how the volunteer state became a hunting ground for women who weaponized trust, authority, and family bonds to commit unimaginable crimes. Serial torturers who kept skull fragments as trophies, accomplices in America's most brutal hate crimes, mothers who starved 7-year-old children to death, and wives who shot sleeping pastors in the back. But here's the most disturbing truth about Tennessee's female killers. They exploited the very relationships and positions that should have provided safety and protection. University students who turned dormitories into murder scenes, teachers who transformed classrooms into predatory hunting grounds, wives who made parsonages into execution sites, caregivers who converted homes into torture chambers. The sentence disparities reveal shocking inconsistencies in Tennessee's justice system. Christa Pike remains the only woman on death row for her teenage torture murder, while Mary Winkler served just 210 days for shooting her pastor husband to death. How does a woman who tortures a classmate and keeps skull pieces as trophies face execution, while another who murders her sleeping husband receives less than a year in jail? These cases force us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, gender, and the nature of evil itself. Should domestic violence claims excuse cold-blooded murder? Does age matter when someone commits torture so brutal that experienced investigators are traumatized? How do we balance understanding the factors that create killers with holding them accountable for destroying innocent lives? Tennessee's female criminals shattered every assumption about women, violence, and the trusted roles that shape our communities. They proved that evil doesn't discriminate by gender, profession, or social status. It thrives wherever people are given power over vulnerable victims. Which case disturbed you most? Should Mary Winkler have received life imprisonment for executing her pastor husband while he slept? Does Christa Pike deserve to be executed for her teenage torture murder after spending over 2 decades on death row? How do we explain the massive sentence disparities between women who committed equally heinous crimes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below about Tennessee's justice system and these shocking sentence differences. Should domestic violence claims excuse premeditated murder? Does the victim's profession matter when determining punishment? Subscribe for more cases that expose how evil hides behind trusted roles and respected positions, because in Tennessee, even the most sacred relationships can mask the darkest crimes imaginable.